So to introduce myself, I'm an associate professor in biomedical engineering at Virginia Tech. I'm director of the Helmet Lab, and I run and maintain the Virginia Tech helmet ratings, which I'll talk to in a little bit. So I thought I would give this talk by maybe giving a brief overview of what we do and what the ratings are to give you some perspective. Probably more important now than ever since this has become the first talk rather than the last talk. And then some of the things we learned along the way. And what I'll really focus on is at least what I attribute as some of the reasons why we've been successful at what we do. Um, so, I run the Helmet Lab, and my primary research is injury biomechanics. So I'm interested in the forces that cause injury to the human body, because the thought is, if we understand those things, we could do things to prevent injury from occurring. I've been at Virginia Tech 15 years. Our research fundings kind of come from all different areas: NIH, NOXI, which is an organization here that sets standards for safety and athletic equipment. The Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, the NCAA, which is the College Athletic Association, and our Department of Defense. And what I'll be talking about today is mostly focused on sports and some of the things we do related to head protection, evaluation of that, and developing methodologies. I do want to point out that this isn't kind of what our intent was. This is just a byproduct of the basic research that we've been doing. So some of our earliest work looking at athletes, it started with football players because they were a convenient population to measure head acceleration data from. Their players more likely to experience an injury than, say, any of us, because they hit their heads willingly on a day-to-day basis. So the thought was, if we instrument observe them, we could collect data to characterize brain injury. And we went ahead and did that. We did that for a number of years. And what I want to point out is our early funding wasn't from the sports industry. It was from the Department of Transportation. It was from Toyota, and eventually NIH, because it was going to let us know kind of the basic biomechanical mechanisms for the onset of brain injury. So, we really started collecting this data to make cars safer. And, if you looked at the program now, you may have never guessed that. But we had been collecting this data from football players for a long time. And one day, our equipment manager at Virginia Tech was asking us, well, we're looking to upgrade our helmets. What helmets should we buy? And we said, we don't know. We don't test helmets, but we could look into it. We might have been the only engineers he knew. And so we bought the helmets and we tested them. And what we saw were huge differences between the helmets that were available at the time. And I'm talking about football now, and I'll transition to bicycle in a minute. But this is kind of setting a foundation. We tested these helmets. They all passed the standard that said, okay, these are safe to sell in the US. And, we tested them all, and some, more than exceeded the standard. Like, it wasn't even close. And there were other helmets in the market that were barely passing the standard, like just skimming under it. And, while none of those helmets are likely to cause a skull fracture or a severe brain injury, there's big differences in the ability of those helmets to reduce concussion risk. So we wanted to make that information available to everyone. And out of that was born Virginia Tech helmet rating. So it was kind of a translational outcome of the research to meet a public need, because at the time, there were no data available on the relative performance of helmets. It was either they pass the standard or they don't. So the first time we released ratings was in 2011. So we're coming up on our 10th year helmet ratings, which will occur in May. And one of the key things, and I'll touch on this at the end again, is, and one of the reasons why I think we've been successful and why the ratings resonate with consumers here, is that it's 100% independent of manufacturer funding. So, this is really, working with organizations and, internal funding mechanisms at Virginia Tech, because we view this as part of our service mission to make these data available. So there is no conflict of interest. So it's an independent rating of manufacturers. And the other thing is, we view it as supplemental testing. There's standards, and we view this as not a replacement for a standard, but in addition to a standard. So NOXI for football helmets, they do a lot of things that we don't do. We test in a specific confine of concussion risk, and then we make those data available to people so they can see the differences. There's a link to our website here. It sort of looks like this. It's going to have a major update over the next few months. We'll be adding ratings for other sports, but right now we have football, youth football, hockey, soccer, bicycle helmet ratings. We're adding rugby. We're adding skiing helmets, and in the next year plus, we're working on a project for equestrian helmets. So this is what it looks like, and this is the user interface. But when I look at the ratings, I think of it as having two primary objectives. The first is to inform consumers of relative differences between helmets in the context of concussion risk. And the second is to provide manufacturers with a design tool to optimize helmet design to best reduce concussion risk in the real world. And these two things kind of feed into each other. So, if consumers want to buy a helmet that's better, they're going to start buying specific helmets, which really forces the manufacturer's hand to kind of get in line with the test method designed so it does well on the test. And then at the end of the day, the consumer has the benefit of having better helmets available. So I want to talk about our general approach, and then I'll talk real brief about some of the specific aspects of our bicycle helmet testing. But all our protocols, regardless of what sport or type of helmet it's for, follow the same general approach. Everything's application specific. So what we do is we characterize the sport-specific head impact exposure and concussion risk in the real world. So what that means is we figure out how they hit their heads, how hard, how frequently, where on the helmet, and then we map. And then at the same time, we're collecting biomechanical and clinical data to say, well, in this environment, these forces are causing injury. We take all that information and we translate it to the lab. So we're mapping the real-world impact scenarios to generalized impact conditions in the lab that are representative of the real-world events. And once we have that controlled setup, our goal is to test every helmet on the market over the range of impact conditions relevant to that application, and then summarize the results into something that's easily digestible for consumers. The fundamental concepts are, tests are weighted based on how often they occur. So, if low severity impacts are more common, they're weighted more in our test. And then helmets at lower head acceleration or velocity, depending on which rating you're looking at, reduce risk. So, lower kinematics resulting from impact are better, and the ratings reflect that too. So I mentioned everything's application specific. So we build custom test equipment to mimic some of those scenarios here. This is what we use for soccer, football over there, where you might get a concussion by two heads hitting one another when they're both going up for a header. Baseball and softball, most of the concussions are associated with ball impacts. It's like maybe a catcher's mask or an umpire mask. So we test those scenarios. And then for bicycle, because they're traveling at speed and falling, we're doing oblique impacts. And I'm just going to give a very high level overview of our bicycle helmet testing for some perspective, and then talk about the reasons why I think we've been somewhat successful in our mission. But when we're looking at bicycle helmets, it's really, we're doing oblique impacts it's a drop test. This is kind of a helmet with a head in it, held in place, drops on an angled anvil that the head form rolls off. It's sandpaper coated to simulate friction on the road. We have a head form with accelerometers and angular rate sensors inside. There's no neck, but we measure the velocity. So we'll drop this head form on different locations on the helmet from different heights to represent real-world test conditions that we think are most appropriate for testing. The way we determine that, we're through damage reconstruction studies where we collected helmets that have been in accidents before. We did some scanning and modeling of those helmets to figure out damage characteristics. So like, what's the area of crush? How deep is the crush? And if we understand those things, we can kind of reverse engineer the problem. So, if we do kind of iterative drops on this location on the helmet, we could figure out what height they fell from. If we look at the scraping in the helmet, we can figure out what speed they were traveling at when they fell, roughly. And we take all that information, the locations on the different helmets, the crush values and the associated velocities that we figured out, and we generalize the test conditions. So our program for bicycle helmets, we test 6 different locations on the helmet, and we test each of these locations at 2 energies. And for each of those, we'll compute risk of concussion and then summarize that into an overall rating. This is what the test looks like, just a GIF of it. But all the tests kind of look the same. They hit this angled anvil and they roll off of it. There's a sudden acceleration and change in velocity that we relate to risk of injury based on some of the fundamental research that we did relating biomechanics in the real world. We first released bicycle helmet ratings. We had 20 helmets. We broke that into a 5-star rating scheme. So, there are 5-star helmets, there are 4-star helmets, there are 3-star helmets, there are a couple 2-star helmets, and we didn't at the time rate anything as a 1-star. The way that the number of stars were determined were from a % reduction from in the event that you were not wearing a helmet. So these star values are tied to injury risk reduction levels compared to not wearing a helmet, under the assumption that if you were not to wear a helmet for every single impact condition that we test, you'd have 100% risk of head injury, which I think is absolutely true if you observe the test. Where we are now, we're to a point where on our website we have 115 bicycle helmet models rated. So, one of the challenges here is there's so many bicycle helmets. There's hundreds of them, and it's challenging to keep up with it. So, we partnered initially with the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety to develop the methodology and test the first batch of helmets, but we've continued this program on our own since, and we're up to 115 helmets. We test all different kinds: road style, urban style, mountain style. And there's some challenges there because, if you're wearing a mountain bike helmet and we're simulating a road accident, that creates discrepancy. And that's something I'll touch on in a minute. But that's an overview. So I wanted to talk a little bit in the last few minutes that I have about some of my takeaways and what I would consider the lessons learned. And I think these are really just to serve as discussion points. I don't want to take up a ton of time, and I want to leave time for questions. And sorry I have to leave early, but feel free to reach out to me if you don't have a chance to, talk about what you want to talk about today. But I look at it as there's two components. There's manufacturer buy-in, and then there's consumer buy-in. And if I think about the manufacturer buy-in, or adopting the methods and using them, some of the things that have helped is, while we're not a standard, we'd have a very open process. Anytime that we're about to release a new set of ratings, we'll hold meetings, normally multiple meetings leading up to it, where we kind of invite industry stakeholders to meetings, we present proposed methodologies, and then we leave time, like months, for input, questions, and concerns to be submitted to us, which we fully investigate. We have scientific rebuttals or adoptions of some of the suggestions that come out of those meetings. And along every step of the way, the methods and the decisions that we make have something we could reference in the research realm. So if there's not an answer to a question already, we'll do studies to figure out, what makes the most sense to do here. And this has been helpful because we've received a lot of criticism along the way for doing some of these. Depending on the sport, not every company has been thrilled about having their helmets on our ratings. Another thing that's helped with manufacturer buy-in is accessible methods. So when we design our test rigs in the lab and the methods that we're going to use, we do our best to make them accessible. Like, what is something that a manufacturer can do to implement that in their lab so that they don't have to come to us every time they want to test a helmet? Like, can they integrate our methods and protocols, which we think are valuable because they're based on real world? So if something tests well in the lab, it should perform well in the real lab. Can they integrate this into part of their R&D process? And then the last thing is that it resonates with consumers, and this is the most important point. And I think one of the sole reasons we've gotten so much buy-in with consumers here, in that they really care about how the helmets perform. It's a safety product, and it should be held accountable for how safe it is. By making these data available, there were tons of interest. Initially, some of the manufacturers tried suing us and bullying us with lawyers and doing what they could to make us stop what we were doing, hiring people to try to discredit the methods that we were using. It was a real mess early on. But at the end of the day, that was a lot of wasted time for some of the manufacturers, because it didn't matter to the consumers. They finally had data and they were using it to buy helmets, and it was affecting their sales. So rather than argue with us, they now dedicated that time to, just getting on board and designing helmets kind of to consider this to some extent and perform better. And, that had a good benefit for them because they all sold more helmets. Like people started buying their better performing helmets than older versions of the helmets that they had. Now, when it comes consumer buy-in, is the main theme here. So, it's important for manufacturers, but how do we get the consumers to buy in? I think one of the things that really helped with that is being independent and not having a conflict of interest. Before we initially released these, the only time you'd see data um, for helmets comparing them is that it was from the manufacturer. And a lot of times it was kind of cherry picked data with nonsensical units that say, look, our helmet's better than our competitor. But um, it, it really, it really helped. When we talk to them, they understand where the data are coming from. They understand we're a university, and we are not making any money off this in any way. This is just something we view as part of our service mission. And then it's easily accessible. So is it easily interpretable to consumers? And do we have research backing it, which we have links to on all our website. We talk about the methods, we link to papers, and they have access to those if they want. And then other thing is, and this is the last point, we publicize the ratings. And that's helped a lot too, because if we didn't have the ability to publicize them, no one would know about them. So letting people know that data are out there has been particularly helpful too, in terms of informing consumers and getting buy-in from them. I think these are the two things. They're linked to one another. The consumers drive everything, but it took a little bit of time, but we were able to get buy-in. Now, I will say, it's the very last thing with our program is that it's been different sport to sport. Like football was very combative. Bicycle helmet manufacturers and companies making helmets were a lot more receptive, and maybe it was based on some of the history that they saw with football in real time. I forgot. This is also about harmonization today, and I just want to raise one point, and then I promise I'm done. Harmonization versus competing methods. For a long time, we were the only shop in town testing helmets and rating helmets, but eventually the NFL a few years ago came out with their own rating scheme. And, we've had a lot of talks with the standards organizations here, with the NFL, with our group, with the manufacturers about harmonizing methods, because it does make it harder on manufacturers to test to multiple methods. I do not necessarily think that harmonization is the best approach. And the reason for that is that, every test method is kind of specific to the environment in which, the methods were developed. And having multiple ways of looking at performance and in finding helmets that perform well across the board is really strong evidence that that particular product's a good helmet. So like the helmets that are at the top of our list and the top of the NFL list perform better across a wider range of impact scenarios than maybe helmets that like are high on our list and low on their list, or low on our list and high on their list. And you're able to test more locations, more velocities, more scenarios, use different impactor types. And if a helmet's performance is good, regardless of how you test it, that's really good evidence. And when you harmonize and everyone adopts the same methods, that might be a little bit counterproductive in that, you might introduce areas that aren't tested that would have been otherwise, and possibly let deficiencies go unnoticed. So that's something we could talk about more later, but it's just kind of maybe a counter argument to the value of harmonization. I think competing methods are ultimately beneficial to the consumer. I think the real challenge is there. How do you do that in a way that makes sense to the consumer? So, we all need to work together in some way, but I think having differing test methods can actually be advantageous to consumers. So that's it. Sorry I went a couple of minutes over, but I'm happy to answer any questions that there might be.